We are ready for a long ride to Rome. The last two chapters of the book of Acts take us on a fascinating trip, and just so many things are packed in to these last two chapters, and I hope you'll find them exciting and interesting as we take a look together at what is happening. Now, I'm being a little bit facetious here with this first slide. If you were to take a trip to revisit the lands of the Apostle Paul and that region of the world, you might find yourself on a cruiser, something like this. I've never been on one of these kind. I don't know that I would ever be able to afford it, but this is not exactly the kind of boat that the Apostle Paul and some others who were with him found themselves sailing on as they left the port of Caesarea. So we'll follow what Luke has to say about this. When it was decided that now notice the word we again. Luke is with Paul, as we would expect at this point, and we'll see at least one other name come up here that we'll recognize. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. Now, I've asked the question here on the slide, did he know Cornelius? It's possible, but it's a long shot because Cornelius was deployed to Caesarea from the Italian band, as we see back in chapter 10, but that's a while ago. And so, whether these two guys ever knew each other or not is really hard to say. But Julius will play a key role in the events of this trip. Now, you might wonder why Luke includes himself in this if he's not a prisoner. And in fact, he's not. One of the things that we'll find is that this ship, like many at that time, were part of what we would designate today as the merchant marines, where the ship owner and those who are carrying the goods to be sold would make a deal with soldiers who needed transportation. And so they would offer free transportation to military personnel being transported from one place to another in exchange for protection from pirates along the way. And so and then if there was any room left over after that, for passengers that wanted to ride along, they could. So Luke is not going in the role of a prisoner nor in the role of a merchant. He's going as a passenger. So really there are three functions that these ships could serve, and just a little bit of background, and that sort of thing, as I said, continues to happen to some degree today. So they get into a ship of Adramyttium. Now, Adramyttium, we'll see on the map just a little bit, really has nothing to do with the Acts narrative, except for the fact that that's the final destination of the ship. You might say today, well, I'm getting on board an airplane in New York City that's bound for LA. But you're going to be stopping, in Des Moines, Iowa, for example. And so that's the idea here. Paul is not going to Adramyttium. The prisoners are only going to go part way, and then they're going to change ships. And they meant to go across the coast of Asia. And of course, that's where Ephesus is, the capital of Asia. And here's the name Aristarchus. Remember, his name was given to us back in chapter 20, verse 4. And you can see other passages where his name is also mentioned. Now, he was with us. He's from Macedonia, and specifically Thessalonica. And you'll remember that that's the capital of Macedonia, not Philippi. Philippi is an important city in Macedonia, but Thessalonica was the capital. So Aristarchus apparently was one who had continued with Paul from the end of his journey and stayed right along with him. And he's sailing on board as well. Now, we're not going to read anything more about him in Acts, so we don't know where he ends up. Maybe he's just getting a ride partway there to Rome and is going to get off in Macedonia to go home. We just don't know for sure. So, as I mentioned, these ships could serve as cargo, for cargo, for soldiers, and for passengers. And we see a little bit of that here in this narrative. So here's Adramyttium, just to give you the reference. You can see that it's well above the region of Ephesus, which is down near the bottom of the map there. In fact, at the very bottom, you can see Miletus, where Paul stopped at the conclusion of his third journey to address the elders there in Ephesus who had come to meet him. But that's where the ship is going to make its final destination. All right, the next day, we landed at Sidon. And Sidon, of course, is on that strip of land that was called Phoenicia back then, part of modern day Lebanon. And Julius, the centurion who's in charge of the ship, treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. Remember, Paul's a Roman citizen, and he must be handled very carefully because nobody wants to have to stand before Roman authorities in Rome to give an account for mistreating a Roman citizen who had not yet been convicted. So, when we had put to sea from Sidon, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Now, here you find the very first hint of something that might be bad, something that could go wrong. The winds were contrary, which means that the seasons are changing and the weather patterns are beginning to shift. And that is going to present some difficulties, and there will be more commented about that later on in the passage. But you just get that very first little suggestion that maybe something is up. And so they try to go under the south side of Cyprus because the winds are starting to blow out of the northeast. And when that happens, the shelter of Cyprus will help protect them from the winds. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. Now, here's Myra, and if you look carefully at the map here, you might recall, whoops, I'm sorry, I went ahead there. You might recall over on the right side, or a little farther to the right, Perga, where Paul and Barnabas landed when they were with John Mark, and then remember John Mark went home at that point. So Myra is closer down to the south part of this stretch of land, and they stop there. All right, so this gives you a little bit bigger picture of where they're going. Caesarea there in Palestine, and then up to Sidon, and that time called Phoenicia, and then following on the south side of the island of Cyprus, then up to Myra. Then you see that dot up at the top there, that's Adramyttium, where the ship will continue to go, but they are getting on board a different vessel. So the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. Now, Alexandria, as you know, is in Egypt. And an interesting fact you might want to keep in mind is that at that time, Egypt was providing about 1/4 of all the wheat consumed in Rome at that time. Rome, of course, the biggest city in the ancient world at that moment. And Alexandria would send many ships full of wheat to provide for the needs in Rome. And of course, that became a huge source of income for the people of Alexandria. And so they get on this Alexandrian ship that's sailing toward Rome. And now the picture I've given you here is just a suggestion. There would have been many different types of Alexandrian ships. If you do a Google search, you can find lots and lots of designs, but this is one that at least gives you perhaps an idea of what the ship may have looked like. Now, notice another hint that things are up weather-wise. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. So things are starting to happen here with the climate that will eventually present some serious problems. Passing it again with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. Okay, now there's just another picture that I found of a model of an Alexandrian ship. Pardon me. And again, probably at least similar to the boat that they would have been sailing on. All right, now If you look right there in the middle of the map, you'll see the island of Cyprus, with which you're already quite familiar. If you go due west, you'll come to that long, skinny island, which is the island of Crete. And this is where they are now. Okay, they have been fighting the wind, but they're able to take advantage of the shelter that comes from being on the south side of the island of Crete. And that red dot right in the middle there is a place called Fair Havens. That's where they have decided to dock. And so, even though it was difficult because of the winds, those winds are coming out of the northeast, they were able to make it there. The problem there is that as we'll see in a few moments, there's no place to winter there. The location of Fair Havens is not set up for spending the winter. Now, verse 9 says, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advises them. Okay, now before we read Paul's advice, let's understand why the mention of the fast. Okay, the fast is another word for the Day of Atonement, one of the important feast days on the Jewish calendar. And when the Jews calculated their sailing times, the seasons that would be appropriate for sailing when the weather was decent, they would calculate it from the Passover, which would be somewhere in our late March or early April, until the Day of Atonement, which would be in our October. And so any time between Passover and the Day of Atonement, the fast, would be considered, the best time for traveling. Outside of those parameters, the weather was changing, the climate was changing, and it was not advisable to travel. But notice the fast is already over. Now, how long it's been over, exactly what time of year we're talking about here, it's hard to say, but we're probably talking about, the middle to latter part of our autumn. So things are changing here weather-wise. And so Paul does something that you might not expect a prisoner to do. He advises these guys. And now just keep in mind that you have the owner of the ship, okay? You have the pilot of the ship or the ship captain, and then you have the centurion who is responsible for the prisoner. So you have three men in positions of authority: the owner, the captain or pilot, and the centurion. And here comes this nobody named Paul, who is a prisoner, and he decides to advise them. And you may think that sounds a bit arrogant, but you also have to keep in mind that Paul has had a lot of experience sailing. On these three missionary journeys, he has been on a lot of ships. In fact, there are some books that have actually tried to calculate how much time Paul would have spent on land and on sea on his journeys. And they're just guesses, but it is an interesting observation. So what does Paul advise them to do or not to do? Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Now, Paul has not received any kind of revelation here. This is just his judgment. Later on, he is going to have a message received by revelation from God to share with the people on board the ship, but not at this moment. And so, Paul is basically telling them we really shouldn't try to go on. But verse 11 says, nevertheless, the centurion, and that's Julius, was more persuaded by the helmsman, and that's the pilot or the captain of the ship, and the owner of the ship, than by the things spoken by Paul. And frankly, that's exactly what you would expect. I mean, if you were Julius, the centurion, and you were consulting with somebody about what to do, you would probably be much more inclined to trust what the captain and what the ship owner had to say than what Paul the prisoner had to say. Okay, so we can't fault these guys for doing that. And because the harbor was not available to winter in, it wasn't set up for wintering, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix. Now, Phoenix was not far away from Fair Havens, and we'll show you a map in just a little bit about that. But it was a harbor of Crete opening toward the south, west, and northwest, and they would winter there because Phoenix was set up for wintering. They had the accommodations that were necessary. And when we come back in the next lecture, we'll take a look at how this all begins to unfold.